The silence in Willow Creek Estates was a manufactured thing, a carefully curated product more expensive than any of the manicured lawns it blanketed. It was the kind of quiet that cost $10,000 in landscaping fees and another $20,000 in HOA dues, a silence built on the unspoken agreement that anything messy, anything loud, anything different, would be ruthlessly pruned away. On this Saturday morning, the silence was performing beautifully. The sun cast long, dramatic shadows from perfectly spherical maple trees. Sprinklers hissed in synchronized rhythm, their arcs of water catching the light like spun glass. It was a portrait of suburban perfection, and at its center, Arthur Finch was committing an act of rebellion. He was letting a single, defiant weed grow near his prize-winning roses. He knelt on a small foam pad, his hands covered in soil, not looking at the weed but rather at the ecosystem around it, the way the morning dew clung to its broad leaves, the way a ladybug traversed its stem. To an observer, he was just a man in his late 40s, dressed in simple gray sweats, tending his garden. His face was calm, thoughtful, the kind of face you might see on a university professor or a librarian, etched with lines of quiet concentration rather than stress. But Arthur wasn't just looking, he was analyzing, processing, cataloging. It was a habit he'd never managed to break. He saw the way his neighbor, Mrs. Gable, paused for a fraction of a second too long while fetching her paper, her gaze flicking from his house back to her own, a clear sign of anxious curiosity. He noted the dark gray sedan that had passed twice in the last 10 minutes, a model not owned by anyone on the cul-de-sac, its driver unidentifiable behind tinted windows. He registered the slight increase in Harrison Vance's lawnmower engine, a spike in RPM that correlated perfectly with his own appearance outside. Harrison Vance, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, was a man who considered the neighborhood less a community and more a kingdom. His own lawn was a putting green of impossible perfection, his house a beige fortress from which he issued decrees on approved mailbox hues and the legally permissible height of decorative flamingos. For the last 6 months, since Arthur had moved in, Vance's decrees had been aimed almost exclusively at him. The notices had started small, a polite, printed reminder that garbage bins could not be visible from the street after 7 p.m. on collection day. Arthur complied. Then came a warning about the length of his grass, measured to a 1/16 of an inch and found wanting. Arthur adjusted his mower blade. Then a violation for a barely visible oil stain on his driveway, a notice about unapproved perennial choices, a complaint about the glare from the solar-powered pathway lights he'd installed. Each notice was a paper-thin slice of aggression, a test. Arthur met each one with silent, meticulous compliance, documenting everything, never giving Vance the confrontation he so clearly craved. Arthur knew men like Vance. He'd spent a 20-year career sitting across from them in small, windowless rooms. Men whose petty tyrannies were just rehearsals for larger cruelties, whose obsession with control was a mask for a deep, gnawing impotence. Vance didn't just want compliance, he wanted submission. He wanted Arthur to feel like an intruder in his own home, an unwelcome variable in his perfect equation. The sound of the lawnmower finally died, replaced by a different kind of silence, a heavy, expectant one. Arthur didn't need to look up to know what was coming. He'd felt the shift in the neighborhood's atmospheric pressure, the subtle change that precedes a storm. He slowly got to his feet, brushing the soil from his hands, and turned. There, at the edge of his pristine driveway, stood Harrison Vance. He wore a crisp polo shirt tucked into pleated khaki shorts, his arms crossed, a smug smirk playing on his lips. But he wasn't alone. Flanking him were 2 men who looked profoundly out of place in the serene landscape of Willow Creek. They were thick-set, dressed in cheap black tactical vests with the words "Community Enforcement" stitched amateurishly across the chest in bold, white letters. One was tall and pale, with a shaved head that reflected the morning sun. The other was shorter, with a messy beard and a nervous tick in his left eye. They were trying to look intimidating, planting their feet wide in scuffed, military-style boots, but they just looked like children playing dress-up. Arthur's eyes took in every detail in a single, fluid scan, the mismatched shades of their black shirts, the way the Velcro on the tall one's vest wasn't properly aligned, the faint smell of stale cigarettes that drifted from them, a scent entirely alien to the floral-scented air of Willow Creek. "Finch," Vance started, his voice a full-throated pronouncement, loud enough for the Gables and anyone else hiding behind their curtains to hear. "We have a problem." Arthur remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He let his gaze drift from Vance to the two imposters and back again. He didn't speak. He knew the most powerful tool in any confrontation was the strategic use of silence. Let the aggressor fill the void, and they will almost always reveal their entire strategy. "Your continued and flagrant disregard for community bylaws has reached its breaking point," Vance declared, puffing out his chest. "You've ignored official notices. You've shown contempt for the rules that hold this fine community together." "I tried to be reasonable." Arthur tilted his head slightly, a gesture of mild curiosity. "What rules are you referring to, Harrison?" The shorter man with the twitching eye stepped forward, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his vest pocket. He began to read in a monotone drone. "Violation 11B, unauthorized landscaping alterations. Violation 7C, improper driveway maintenance. Violation 19F, failure to comply with aesthetic harmony standards." He paused, licking his lips nervously. "And, non-cooperation with board inquiries." Arthur's expression didn't change. "I see. And these gentlemen are?" "They are duly authorized community enforcement officers," Vance said, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "And they are here to ensure your compliance. We can't have your kind of element undermining the very fabric of this neighborhood." The taller man took a menacing step forward, trying to use his height for intimidation. "We're here to detain you, sir. You'll be held until the local police can arrive to process you." The word hung in the air, absurd and obscene in the quiet morning. Detain. It was the word Vance had been waiting for, the ultimate expression of his power. He expected shock, fear, maybe anger. He expected a reaction. He got nothing. Arthur Finch simply stood there, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth, his eyes holding a look of profound, analytical calm. It wasn't the look of a man being threatened. It was the look of a predator who had just watched his prey walk willingly into a perfectly set trap. That smug, knowing smile was more infuriating to Harrison Vance than any string of shouted curses could have been. It was the smile of a man who possessed a secret, a man who was watching a different movie than everyone else on the street. "Wipe that look off your face, Finch," Vance snapped, his voice tight. "This is a serious matter. Your arrogance is precisely the problem." Arthur let the silence stretch for another beat before he finally spoke, his voice even and measured, completely devoid of fear. It was a lecturer's voice, patient and clear. "The problem, Harrison, is that you're operating under a series of profound miscalculations. But please, continue. I'm finding this demonstration of yours incredibly illuminating." He shifted his gaze from Vance, dismissing him as irrelevant, and focused on the taller of the two imposters, the one with the shaved head. "You, for instance," Arthur said, his tone becoming conversational. "You stand with your weight on your left foot. It's a subtle shift, but consistent. A compensation for a weak right knee, likely an old injury that aches when the weather gets damp. You favor it without even realizing. Tell me, does it bother you more in the morning?" The man's eyes, hidden behind cheap mirrored sunglasses, were unreadable, but his jaw muscle twitched. He instinctively tried to shift his weight, to correct the stance Arthur had just pointed out, but the very act of thinking about it made him clumsy. "Don't talk to him," Vance barked. "He's trying to distract you." Arthur's gaze slid to the second man, the shorter one with the nervous tick. "And you? Your pulse is visible in your neck. I'd estimate it at around 115 beats per minute. That's high for a man at rest, even under mild stress. It suggests a heavy reliance on stimulants. Based on the faint yellow stain on your collar and the specific chemical odor on your breath, I'd wager it's a steady diet of Viper Venom energy drinks, the off-brand kind they sell at the gas station on the highway. Am I close? The man's eye twitch intensified. He unconsciously touched his collar, his face paling slightly. He exchanged a panicked glance with his partner. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were the ones with the vests, the ones with the authority. They were supposed to intimidate the quiet professor, not be dissected by him. From across the street, the curtain in the Hendersons' front window moved again. Old Mr. Henderson was now standing there, his arms folded, no longer pretending he wasn't watching. A few houses down, a teenage boy, Liam, who was supposed to be washing his dad's car, had paused, his phone held loosely in his hand, the screen dark but pointed directly at Arthur's driveway. The audience was growing, and the script was veering into uncharted territory. Vance, seeing his perfect power play begin to unravel, tried to seize back control. Their personal health is none of your business. They are acting on behalf of this HOA, and you are in violation. Now, are you going to comply, or will they be forced to use restraints? Restraints, Arthur repeated the word slowly, savoring it like a fine wine. That implies a lawful authority to do so. An authority you don't possess. What you're describing, Harrison, is not enforcement. It's assault. It's kidnapping. Those are felony charges. Are you aware of the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for kidnapping in this state? He paused, looking directly at the shorter man. I'm asking you, the one with the elevated heart rate. What's your name? Don't answer him, Gary. Vance commanded. The name was out. Gary flinched, his eyes wide. His partner shot him an angry look. Arthur's smile widened slightly. Gary. Thank you, Harrison. Now, Gary, Harrison here is giving you an unlawful order. An order that could land you in a state penitentiary for 5 to 10 years. He, as the mastermind, would likely get longer. Harrison is a wealthy man. He can afford a team of expensive lawyers who will argue he was misinformed, that you two acted as rogue agents. He'll paint you as incompetent thugs. And when the judge asks you why you put your hands on a man on his own property, what will your answer be? That the man's grass was too long. Gary swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at Vance, then at his partner, then at the perfect houses surrounding them. He suddenly felt trapped, exposed under the bright Texas sun. The $500 Vance had promised them to play tough for an hour suddenly seemed like a down payment on a prison sentence. The taller man, however, was made of sterner, or perhaps dumber, stuff. Shut up, he growled, taking another step forward. You talk too much. We're not here to debate the law with you. Aren't you? Arthur replied, his voice dropping into a lower, more serious register. You should be. The law is all that separates a society from chaos. It's the wall that protects men like you from men like me. But you see, the thing about walls is that they have doors, and you need the right key to open them. You too, he said, his gaze sweeping over them, brought a crowbar to a place where only a key will work. He took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance slightly. He was no longer just defending, he was advancing. So tell me, Dale, he said, his eyes locking onto the taller man's sunglasses. The man froze. He hadn't said his name. No one had said his name. Vance's face contorted in confusion. How did you? Dale started, his voice a low rasp. Arthur ignored him, pressing the advantage. Tell me, Dale. When Mr. Vance hired you for this little performance, did he pay you in cash? I'm guessing he did. Untraceable. Plausible deniability. He's smarter than you are. He knows how to create a buffer. But what he doesn't know is that men like you always leave a trace. For example, the red clay dust in the treads of your boots. It's not from around here. This area has black soil. That clay is specific to the industrial park out by the old quarry, the same place you were fired from your last security gig 3 months ago for, what was it again? Oh, yes. Selling company property on eBay. A case of 50 flashlights, wasn't it? You got $120 for them. Hardly seems worth a criminal record, does it? The mirrored sunglasses could no longer hide the shock. Dale's mouth opened and closed silently. He took an involuntary step back, his illusion of power completely shattered. Across the street, Liam raised his phone and pressed record. The clatter of plastic on concrete is a small sound, but in the manufactured quiet of Willow Creek Estates, it sounded like a gunshot. It was the sound of Dale's mirrored sunglasses, which had slipped from his stunned face and hit the driveway. He didn't bend to pick them up. His eyes, now exposed, were wide with a kind of primal fear. It wasn't the fear of a bully being confronted, it was the terror of a ghost seeing a priest. He was looking at a man who knew his secrets, a man who had reached into his past and pulled out a greasy, shameful truth for the whole world to see. Across the driveway, Gary was openly trembling, his face slick with a cold sweat. He kept wiping his palms on his tactical vest, the rough fabric making a scratching sound. "What is this? What the hell is going on?" he whispered to no one in particular. Harrison Vance's face was a mask of crimson fury. His neat, orderly world was spiraling into chaos. The pawns he had so carefully placed on the board were refusing to play their part. The public humiliation he had orchestrated for Arthur was now turning back on him, magnified 100-fold by the growing number of silent, watching neighbors. "Don't listen to him," Vance roared, his voice cracking with strain. "He's a liar. He's trying to intimidate you. Do your job." He jabbed a finger at Arthur. "Get him. Detain him now. That's an order." But the word order was hollow now. It had lost its power. Dale didn't move. Gary looked like he was about to be sick. Seeing his authority evaporate, Vance made the gravest miscalculation of his life. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out, intending to shove Arthur, to provoke a physical response, to do something to regain the upper hand. "I said, get him," he shouted, his fingers just inches from Arthur's chest. He never made contact. Arthur's movement was a study in economy. It was so fast, so fluid, it was almost invisible. One moment he was standing relaxed, the next his left hand had shot out, not to block Vance's arm, but to intercept it. His fingers wrapped around Vance's wrist, his thumb finding a precise point on the radial nerve. He applied no visible force, no violent twist. It was just a slight, clinical pressure. Vance let out a choked gasp, his entire body going rigid. A jolt of pure, white-hot fire shot up his arm, from his wrist to his shoulder, rendering it completely useless. His eyes bulged, and a strangled noise escaped his throat. He was paralyzed, held in place by a grip that was as inescapable as it was painless just a second ago. Arthur leaned in, his voice no longer the calm, analytical tone of a professor, but a low, chilling whisper that was for Vance alone. "You will never, ever, lay a hand on me again. Do you understand?" He applied a fraction more pressure, and Vance's knees buckled. Arthur released him as abruptly as he had grabbed him. Vance stumbled back, clutching his arm, his face a mixture of shock, pain, and utter disbelief. He looked at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. The crowd of neighbors gasped collectively. Mr. Henderson took a step off his porch. Liam's phone was now held in a steady, two-handed grip. The script had been irrevocably flipped. Arthur paid Vance no more mind. He was a neutralized threat. He turned his attention back to the two men who were now looking at him as if he were something supernatural. "Dale," Arthur said, his voice returning to its calm cadence, though now it was laced with an edge of tempered steel. "You're trespassing. You're an accessory to a conspiracy to commit a felony. You have two options. You can stay here and wait for the real police, who I assure you are on their way, or you can get in your car and disappear." If you choose the latter, you will leave the state. You will not contact Harrison Vance again. You will forget this address and my name. If you do this, I will not feel compelled to forward my file on you to the district attorney. The choice is yours. Dale didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. He didn't even bother to pick up his sunglasses. He turned and practically ran down the street, his cheap boots slapping against the pavement in a panicked rhythm. One enforcer down. Arthur now turned to the last man standing. Gary was rooted to the spot, his face ashen. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. "Gary," Arthur said, his voice softening slightly, becoming almost sympathetic. "Oh, Gary. You're not like Dale. You're not a petty thief. You're just a man drowning in bad decisions." Gary flinched as if struck. "You have a daughter, don't you, Gary? Her name is Chloe. She's 7. She likes ballet, but the lessons are expensive. Your wife works 2 jobs to try and make ends meet, but the medical bills from her mother's illness last year wiped out your savings. And then there's the other thing, isn't there? The Friday night poker games. The ones you told your wife were just for fun, a few bucks with friends. But it became more than that. You got in deep with a man named Sergey. And Sergey is not the kind of man who accepts late payments." Tears welled in Gary's eyes. He shook his head, whispering, How could you know that?" "It's my job to know that," Arthur said simply. "I know that Sergey gave you a deadline. Today. He needs $3,000, or he's going to come to your house and explain the concept of compound interest to your wife. Harrison Vance offered you $500 for 1 hour of work. You thought it was an easy way out. A lifeline. But you see, Gary, this isn't a lifeline. It's an anchor. And it's pulling you down into something much deeper and darker than a debt to a loan shark." Arthur took a step closer, and Gary flinched, but Arthur's hands remained at his sides. "I'm going to give you the same choice I gave Dale. You can walk away. Go home to your family. But I'm going to add a condition. You are going to go to the police, not today, but tomorrow. You are going to give them a full statement about what Harrison Vance hired you to do. You will be a cooperating witness. If you do that, I will make a call. The DA will be lenient. And as for Sergey, let's just say his business practices are about to come under intense scrutiny from a department that has a much longer reach than his. Your debt will be the least of his problems." Gary stared at him, his mouth agape, tears now streaming freely down his cheeks. He nodded numbly, unable to speak. He dropped the crumpled violation notice from his nerveless fingers and turned, walking away like a man in a trance, a man just saved from a firing squad. Harrison Vance was now completely alone, standing in the middle of the driveway, surrounded by the wreckage of his perfect plan. The neighbors were no longer hiding. They were standing openly on their lawns, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. Vance's kingdom had crumbled, and he was the last one to realize he was no longer the king. Arthur Finch turned, his face calm, his eyes cold and clear, and fixed his gaze on the man who had started it all. The interrogation was about to begin. The silence that descended was different now. It was no longer the serene, manufactured quiet of a Saturday morning. It was a vacuum, the dead air that follows an explosion. Harrison Vance stood in that vacuum, a solitary figure on the empty stage of Arthur's driveway. His enforcers were gone. His authority was a vapor. All that remained were the eyes, dozens of them, from every window, every porch, a jury of his own neighbors staring at him with a cold, dawning clarity. Arthur took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He wasn't menacing. He wasn't angry. He was something far more terrifying to a man like Vance. He was disappointed. "It was never about the grass, was it, Harrison?" Arthur's voice was soft, yet it carried across the lawns, each word landing like a carefully placed stone. "It wasn't the garbage bins, or the oil stain, or the perennials. It was me. Vance, still cradling his arm, looked up, his face a blotchy canvas of rage and humiliation. You have no idea what it takes to maintain a community like this. The standards. The property values. People invest their lives here. I am protecting their investment from people who don't respect what we've built. What you've built, Arthur corrected gently. This isn't a community in your eyes, Harrison. It's a terrarium. A perfectly controlled environment where every blade of grass, every color of paint, every resident, must conform to your exact specifications. And I don't conform, do I? I'm the variable you can't solve for. Arthur took another step. You're a man who lives by the book, Harrison. A book you wrote yourself. You believe that if you can control everything on the outside, the lawns, the mailboxes, the people, you can silence the chaos on the inside. You crave the respect you feel you're owed, but you don't know how to earn it. So you try to legislate it. You try to enforce it with threats and fines. You confuse obedience with admiration. You think fear is a synonym for respect. They are not the same thing. Every word was a precise incision, laying bare the pathetic machinery of Vance's psyche. From his porch, Mr. Henderson called out, his voice firm and clear. He's right, Harrison. This has gone too far. This isn't about standards anymore. This is a vendetta. A vendetta? Vance spun around, his eyes wild. I am upholding the bylaws that you all agreed to. He's the one who thinks he's above the rules. No, Arthur's voice cut through Vance's tirade, sharp and final. The problem isn't that I think I'm above your rules. The problem for you is that I operate by a different set, one with much higher stakes. You mentioned my kind of element undermining the neighborhood. You said I needed to be processed. You used words that have nothing to do with landscaping. This was about power, and it was about prejudice. A wave of murmurs rippled through the onlookers. The accusation hung in the air, undeniable. Vance's face went from red to a pasty white. He opened his mouth to retort, to deny, to say anything, but no words came out. He had been so focused on Arthur's non-compliance that he'd never once considered Arthur might be documenting his. For the last 6 months, Harrison, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, every notice you sent, every complaint you filed, every interaction we've had, has been meticulously logged, dated, and preserved. I have copies of the emails you sent to the board, the ones where you described me as a disruptive influence, before I'd even unpacked all my boxes. I have a sworn statement from the surveyor you hired to find a property line violation, admitting you offered him a bonus to fabricate his report. I have the metadata from the photos you took of my house, showing you were trespassing on my property at 3 a.m. to do it. Arthur paused, letting the weight of it all sink in. I wasn't ignoring you, Harrison. I was building a file. A comprehensive, beautifully detailed file documenting a targeted campaign of harassment. And this morning you gave me the centerpiece for my collection. He gestured to the empty driveway. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Impersonating an officer. Attempted assault. You didn't just cross a line, Harrison. You drove a freight train through it. And you did it in front of 24 witnesses and at least 3 active video recordings. Liam, the teenager, almost unconsciously raised his phone a little higher, a silent confirmation. Vance looked around, from house to house, his gaze pleading. But the faces that looked back were cold. He had lost them. He had been their king, but he had just been exposed as nothing more than a petty, obsessive fool. His reign was over. The HOA board will be hearing from my lawyer on Monday, Arthur stated, not as a threat, but as a simple fact. I imagine they'll be very interested in how you've been misusing association funds to pay for your personal vendettas. I suspect an audit is in order. Followed by an emergency vote for your immediate removal as president. After that, the civil suit will be filed. And then, Harrison, then comes the criminal complaint. A faint, distant sound began to cut through the air. A siren. It was still miles away, but it was growing steadily louder. The sound of real authority. The sound of consequence. Arthur looked at the man who had tried to ruin his peace, a man now utterly broken and alone in the middle of a perfect street. "You wanted to make an example of me," Arthur said, his voice holding not a trace of triumph, only a deep, profound weariness. "And you have. You've shown everyone in Willow Creek exactly what happens when a small man is given a little bit of power and a great deal of insecurity." The siren grew from a distant cry to an insistent wail, turning heads as a black and white police cruiser turned onto the cul-de-sac. It slowed, its tires hissing on the clean asphalt, and came to a stop right at the edge of Arthur's driveway, the flashing red and blue lights washing over Harrison Vance's pale, sweat-streaked face. The siren died, leaving only the low thrum of the engine and the crackle of a radio. A uniformed officer stepped out, a man in his 50s with a calm, weathered face and a sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. He surveyed the bizarre scene, one man standing calmly, another looking utterly broken, and a gallery of 24 neighbors watching as if it were a tennis match. The sergeant's experienced eyes took it all in, and he walked not to Vance, the supposed authority figure, but directly to Arthur. "Morning, sir," the sergeant said, his voice a respectful baritone. "Dispatch got a call about a possible impersonation. Can you tell me what's happening here?" Arthur gave a slight nod, his demeanor unchanged. "Good morning, Sergeant." "That's correct. This man, Harrison Vance, the HOA president, hired 2 individuals wearing tactical vests to unlawfully detain me on my private property. They have since fled the scene. However," Arthur gestured discreetly with his head toward Liam, "the entire incident has been thoroughly documented by multiple witnesses." The sergeant's gaze flicked over to Liam, who gave a nervous but affirmative nod, then to the other neighbors, who all stood as silent confirmation. The officer then turned to Harrison Vance, his professional demeanor hardening. "Sir, I need you to step over to my vehicle, please. I'm going to need to see some identification." Vance sputtered, his last vestiges of authority crumbling into dust. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding. I am the president of this community. This man. He was violating, sir," the sergeant cut him off, his voice flat and non-negotiable. "To my vehicle. Now." Defeated, Vance shuffled toward the police car, a man being escorted from his own throne room. As the sergeant began to question him, the spell over the neighborhood finally broke. Neighbors began to speak to each other in low, urgent whispers. Mr. Henderson caught Arthur's eye from across the street and gave a slow, deliberate nod of respect. A new order had been established. Arthur watched for a moment longer, a silent observer to the consequences he had set in motion. Then, with the calm purpose of a man whose Saturday morning had been interrupted but not ruined, he turned away from the flashing lights. He walked to the end of his driveway, bent down, and picked up his forgotten morning newspaper. He folded it neatly under his arm, turned his back on the quiet chaos of the street, and walked up the pristine path to his front door. The door opened and closed with a soft click, and just like that, he was gone. The silence returned to Willow Creek Estates, but it was a different silence now. It was no longer manufactured. It was earned.